That's a great question.
One of the things I was really excited about when you and I talked, and one thing that I think a lot of people are excited to hear about, is just the role of democratic socialism in the political moment that we inhabit at the moment. And, it's one thing for me in one of the deepest blue districts in the country in San Francisco, running against an entrenched Democratic incumbent. And I know you've got a very different landscape where you're at. I mean, maybe if we talked for a minute about our respective visions and then our landscape, so we can get into some of those questions about democratic socialism. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great. Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of why we're running and what we hope to accomplish in our particular district and its needs.
Something like that, yeah. Like what? Let's share with our with the folks joining us what drives you to run for the seat that you're seeking.
Absolutely. So I work on a farm at a nonprofit housing community, a permanent supportive housing community for people experiencing homelessness. And I love that job. We grow food. I love food for people who benefit from that food health-wise and socially. And we know through that experience that homelessness is not just a housing issue. It is an issue of overlapping and interlocking need and oppression, and that I have friends who have been without a stable household for 10 or 20 or 30 years.
Wow.
And in 2016 I lost a lot of people to hospital stays that they didn't return from, and the grief that was caused by that, or to prison, or to mental health episodes that were significant. And in that same moment, watching the political landscape and realizing that my struggle and my grief alongside of my friends was not an accident, that this wasn't actually outside of the system as it stands. And especially in November of 2016, amongst the entire nation, watching as we realize that cracks in the system don't just appear and people don't just fall through them, that actually
they are engineered.
That's right. And so I turned to, in that moment of just like utter frustration, to community organizing here in Texas, and got to work on some really incredible campaigns and coalition campaigns around paid sick days for all workers, campaigns pursuing Medicare for all here, getting our reps to sign on to it, not my rep, but other local reps to sign on to it, pursuing more transparent and accountable police departments. And I just got hooked at what happens when we knock on our neighbors' doors, what happens when we gather at our schools and in our unions, and begin to talk about the power that escalates, that we have access to when we access one another. And so this congressional run is a huge jump for me. It was not something I ever expected to do, but knowing that we have a lot to fight for, that Texas is bottom of the list when it comes to healthcare, that we're nearing the bottom of the list when it comes to education, that's getting worse all the time, and that where Texas goes on the oil and gas industry, that the rest of this country follows, and honestly, like a lot of the globe is affected by where Texas goes on renewable energy as well. So knowing that we can be a flag that blows in the wind like so many of our Democratic representatives, we can be someone who opposes like Roger Williams, who is the person that I'm running to unseat, or we can be actually the momentum for change, the wind itself that moves us in the direction that we have to move when fighting in coalition, when standing alongside of our neighbors. And that just fills me with enthusiasm every time I think about it and every time we work on it.
I love your poetry. I'll try to meet you there as an artist and a lawyer and an advocate and an organizer. I'm motivated to challenge Speaker Pelosi for her seat representing San Francisco in the House, simply because I can't bear to see our city represented by so relatively conservative a voice. On one issue after another, I see the speaker supporting a criminal administration in the White House. I see my own vision for the future in which we can all have human rights to healthcare and housing and food as a vision that she actively stands in the way of. If I rewind the tape to my own political beginning, some of my first political acts were protests around anti-globalization and Bush's invasion of Iraq. And Speaker Pelosi was unfortunately funding those wars as we here in the Bay Area were organizing rallies and marches and protests to try to stop it. I saw Speaker Pelosi unfortunately stand against human rights, from CIA torture in 2006 and the continuing cover-up since then, to Trump's concentration camps at the border not far from you. And I can't tolerate it. San Francisco is a deeply progressive city. It's a city that's deeply committed to human rights, and that's a commitment that unites the community. And we deserve to have a representative that stands in favor of those values. And I think that's a perspective that the country needs this city to have in Congress. If I think about the way, when you were describing, for instance, the flag blowing in the wind versus the wind itself, love that imagery. It reminds me a little bit of when many of the folks I admire on Team Bernie 2020 talk about the thermostat versus the thermometer, and the mainstream corporate Democratic wing of the party as a thermometer that, and they govern like thermometers and they run like thermometers. They base so much of their opinions on polls that indicate where is the current time slice ephemeral consensus, and they abdicate any opportunity to persuade and inform and inspire. And so much of the last, I think, several years, certainly let's say since 2016, since President Trump won his election in November, I think, or more accurately, since Hillary Clinton lost an election that November, I think that there's been a sustained transformation, at least across the liberal and progressive wings of the body politic, as people have embraced opportunities to learn more. We can see this in the swelling ranks of democratic socialist groups around the country. I think we can see this in the dramatic swing to the left apparent in presidential Democratic debates, and the race to see who can outdo each other and clamoring to look like Bernie Light as they present themselves to the electorate as, less socialist alternatives. And at the moment, I see the country generationally poised to shrug off the yoke of a failed predatory past. And I see it, frankly, as inevitable. The generational transition that is seeing our older neighbors on and our younger ones into their adulthood, I think is wreaking a shift in the body politic that will be an earthquake. We've only seen the beginning tremors. Bernie 2016, Ocasio-Cortez 2018 were just the beginnings, and I'm looking forward to joining you in Congress in 2021. So tell us a little bit about the landscape of your district and some of the issues that you've been bringing to bear in it, and how people have responded to you in the course of the campaign so far.
Yeah, thank you. That I love your perspective, and I love that every time we talk about multi-generational movement building. It's not acknowledged enough how much we are all in this together.
Right.
District 25 here in Texas is an incredibly gerrymandered district. It is from the urban core of Austin, some of the lowest income neighborhoods, through the center of Austin near the University of Texas campus, out through West Austin, which is relatively wealthy, relatively stable families, and folks who are retiring. But then it expands massively across the state of Texas into some suburban, but mostly rural regions. It goes south in some areas that are ranch land. They are the land that the pipelines are threatening here. Every single day they are pushing back against that. It swings north. It actually takes me almost 5 hours to drive across my district. And in Texas, we measure things in terms of driving time, not actual distance. But then we swing north and we get traditional sort of rural towns and neighborhoods, beautiful places where folks are still in those trades of growing, of building, of caring for the landscape of their communities, where we know that in particular hospitals are being shut down at unprecedented rates, schools are scattered and underfunded, and families are broken apart because there are not jobs. Those jobs have intentionally been underfunded or have been organized overseas or have been just driven into the ground by bigger and bigger businesses who pay less and less for the work. And so the children of our rural families are moving out of those towns. It has been a red district since it was drawn. It was gerrymandered away from a specific representative and has held Republicans since that time, pretty staunchly Republican. Last cycle moved for the first time to a 9-point difference, which was substantial. We got the huge Beto bump here in Texas when he ran for office. But it's still a challenge because in Texas, like in so many places across the country, it feels like urban areas are supposed to be Democratic and rural areas are supposed to be Republican. And that is how organizing along traditional electoral lines goes here. That's who people reach out to. That's who people count on. And for me, what I see is a very working class district, is people who are trying their hardest to take care of the people that they love, and who actually, when you talk to them about it, they don't just want good things for themselves, they want good things for their neighbors. Because in our rural communities, there is a mindset that a town requires everyone in the town to be thriving for the town itself to thrive. And I think there's a mentality of divisiveness that is used against our rural communities that we have the opportunity to speak real truth against, that actually those who are dividing us are doing that to keep us all weak. So we're visiting every single one of those spaces. And it's fascinating because I can talk about public housing here in Austin, where we have public housing, where that has gone through the traditional way of clearly some like racist divestment since the Reagan administration. Mm-hmm. And we can point to the sort of dilapidated buildings that are in need of care, so that the people inside of them feel care and stability. In rural areas, though, like you said, we are talking to people who are aging, people whose children are not able to find, growing children are not able to find financial stability. And I can go to Lampasas, Texas, and I can talk about public housing. And I was nervous, to be honest. I wasn't sure, but they love it because public housing is democratic control, and because public housing is a way of demonstrating care for our neighbors. And there is the real sense that care actually elevates all of us. It's a really values-driven district, I think, at its heart.
A policy that reflects empathy, and that's beautiful. A, thank you for doing that work. B, it's impressive that you're able to do it in a district that is so diverse, right? I mean, that's like a cultural diversity that sort of like changes even the meaning of the word as it's generally constructed. In some respects, here in San Francisco, we have like a very inverse situation. If it takes you 5 hours to drive across your district, you can walk across our district in 5 hours. It's pretty, and not even all of it. You know, San Francisco it encompasses all of the 12th Congressional District of California. That's the one I'm running in, and then part of the 14th that extends into the peninsula to the south. And if in your district you're struggling with, I think, the predictable and frankly intentional consequences of partisan gerrymandering to crack and pack urban districts, to diffuse their voting power, or to alternatively concentrate it and deny the number of seats over which it could otherwise hold influence, that's an intentional stratagem that much of the country is subjected to. And it basically such a system where instead of voters choosing their representatives, you effectively have representatives choosing who their voters are. And here in San Francisco, I feel very fortunate that we have an independent redistricting commission, and so our district is drawn quite fairly. It respects a contiguity of community, and it is just the city of San Francisco for all intents and purposes, carving out a portion of the southwest corner of the city. So to that extent, I feel very lucky hearing you just about the milieu in which I have a chance to to run. We have a very diverse community in terms of its demographics. it's Latino, it's Asian, it's white, it's the African American population here is unfortunately very low after, frankly, decades of displacement and gentrification that have also systematically lowered the Latino, at least shifted the Latino population more than lowered it. And there has been displacement, and housing crisis here in San Francisco is the central local political issue. It is the issue that everyone is challenged by. I myself am housing insecure. I think I've moved half a dozen times over the 20 years that I've lived in the Bay Area. And to see the unanimity across a very diverse community that we cannot any longer tolerate the predatory corporate fleecing of our working families and future generations. That's something that I think is coming increasingly to unite all generations, not just young people who have been, I think, alarmed by the climate crisis, particularly since their very young age, but even those, I'm Gen X, and I think my contemporaries also have been alarmed for a long time and also unsure how to engage a system in which perhaps the boomers had all the control. I don't want to throw the boomers under the bus because we have many allies in that generation too. And maybe this is an interesting point of perhaps, I don't think it'll be constructive tension necessarily, but just to dive into one piece, I feel sometimes as though within our circles on the left, there's a lot of demonization of wealthy people, and I understand the reasons for it. At the end of the day, I want to pin the tail on institutions, because it's not, I know plenty of wealthy people in San Francisco who are frankly aghast at the climate crisis, and they do favor Medicare for all, and they do favor racial justice. But even from a position of wealth, how to dismantle mass incarceration to them is not immediately apparent. And I think the need for us to focus on institutional actors, and when I say that, I mean to say Congress and prosecutors and enforcement agencies, there are a lot of opportunities for us to advance our socialist vision by regulating and enacting policy to shift institutional actors so that they're guarding the public interest instead of preying on it. And a big part of that, of course, is by bringing more of our decisions into the public sphere, out of the sphere of private capital and profit making. And that's maybe, as we're thinking about democratic socialism, in this moment, I see that agenda to subject to public control companies like, and I know you being in Texas, this is kind of poignant, but fossil fuel extraction companies and companies involved in that part of the climate crisis, or companies like public utilities, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, here in California, is a company whose serial malfeasance has led to catastrophic wildfires that have killed dozens of people, fewer this year, thankfully, than last year, which was particularly rough. But that's a company that, because it's privately controlled, it makes decisions to maximize its shareholders' interests instead of the interests of the community, instead of the working families that work there, or the workers who work there and their families, and instead of the future generations, or frankly, in the context of these kinds of environmental externalities, we're talking about shared global resources. Anyway, so I'm babbling now, but do you have any thoughts on sort of that public-private distinction and balance and that kind of struggle we're waging?
For sure, yeah. I think for me in particular, it rings true coming from a background in the nonprofit world that I bump into in that space quite a few people with a lot of privilege and a lot of wealth, and they are human, and they feel the problems that we feel, and yet are complicit in the systems that continue to perpetuate those issues. And knowing that it isn't up to one individual to make a moral choice, or to choose their individual action, their course that will change our society, that it's actually getting power back into the hands of the masses, of all of us, that will at the end uproot the system that demands that profit be hoarded by a few. When we were fighting for paid sick days in Austin, it was fascinating to talk to small business owners who really struggled to make it in a climate where it's absolutely cutthroat. And I think one of the advantages that we have is to pull back from that competitive agenda altogether of capitalism that pits us against one another, whether on an individual level or on the small business to business level, that says it's always a zero-sum game, and to say, actually, democracy can look like social well-being. It can balance the needs of many people at the same time. And so what we end up talking about quite a bit is the idea that the more people we engage and get into the process, the more cracks we can create in that system of hoarded power. The more people we can drive through those cracks, the more we can open them to participation. And the more participation we get, the more balanced our structures are, the more opportunity we have to build equity. I don't think it's an automatic one-to-one there, but I think that unless we are building access points for our voices, for control, for power building, for democracy, then we have no chance at actually hearing the needs of and responding to those from a variety of vantage points. When under capitalism, we are always driving to a singular point, and we see this right now, that fewer and fewer people are holding more and more wealth, and that wealth is an indicator of also their influence. And so influence is being determined on a cultural, on a national level by fewer and fewer people who, like you said, the system is not created to be responsive to our collective needs. And so we need collective power for that to be a true and a resonant response and a just response. And so when we are out, we are not just talking about we need you to vote. We are also talking about we need you to join the institutions of power that exist to you throughout our economy. We need you to join your union. We need you to join your school board. We need you to organize with your local sunrise group. We need you to join DSA. We need you to be these wedges, these crack creators, these people who bring others into those vantage points of power.
Yes, absolutely. And I see that as one point and sort of methodological comment that I take a great deal of inspiration from Bernie in. And I think of that as almost like community-centered organizing beyond electoral work. I saw in his 2016 campaign a recognition of the opportunity for a presidential campaign, instead of extracting all the energy from social movements to, like traditional corporate Democrats do, by sucking up attention and donations and then failing to go to bat for the principles of the communities that they essentially rely on for support. I saw Bernie go to bat for the communities who he's relying on for support. I saw Bernie shout those communities and those organizations out. I saw him on the front line of picket lines. I saw him driving his volunteers to show up in solidarity with frontline community groups. And that's very much the model that we've tried to emulate on our campaign. And this is one thing I feel an affinity with you. I was a nonprofit advocate before running for this seat, and coming out of a public interest background, even though the organizations that you and I both worked for are legally unpermitted to participate in electoral politics. And so it sort of forces us to cultivate new bases of support. The fact that we've demonstrated solidarity for so long in all of these different communities, I've done work defending LGBT rights, and I've had an opportunity to do work defending digital rights in the privacy context, and do work defending human rights in the face of CIA torture and the camps at the borders. And like in all those contexts, that advocacy is solidarity, and the solidarity, especially when it's not merely just rhetorical, but grounded in action, showing up at the picket line, at the rally, bringing volunteers to participate and support, connecting people in our respective orbits, whether online or in person, to these networks that they can continue to support well after the electoral cycles that we are currently running from will be, objects of ephemeral history. I think those are the real opportunities for us, and to recognize our roles as candidates for electoral office, seeking to represent our respective constituencies, as we already, in the context of campaigning, represent social movements, that we come from a movement around the country of socialists who aspire to a brighter, more humane, more empathetic tomorrow. And one thing I really appreciated about the way you were framing this idea of sort of like, a community and the role of community, maybe the act local in the think global, was I sometimes, as I describe democratic socialism, I go off on this riff about how I put the D back in democratic socialism because I'm very concerned about guarding our democratic process even as we aspire to socialist ideals. So, whether it's privatizing fossil fuel companies to make sure that they're not plundering our global resources, whether it's nationalizing weapons manufacturers to make sure that they're not peddling wars that serve no purpose, as we seem frequently to pursue. Those are socialist aspirations. Establishing human rights to healthcare and housing and food. These are socialist aspirations. At the same time that we seek those, I'm very concerned about the process to get there. And usually when I talk about the threats to democracy, I'm focused on executive secrecy, because that precludes legislative oversight, it precludes judicial review, or I'm thinking about the surveillance regime that inhibits our vulnerable neighbors from speaking their voices and how that kills democracy for all of us, whether or not any of us have anything to hide. Usually I'm thinking about voting rights withering under the attack of right-wing state legislatures like the one that gerrymandered your state. I don't normally talk about, but I do think of in different terms, and I'm glad you connected these for me, but the role of our campaigns in building democracy at a time when it is in crisis. And I'm glad to share that project with you. I think that's a really compelling way to present sort of the role, I think, of our campaigns, at least relative to democratic socialism. I keep asking all the questions. I'm curious if you.
Well, I think that one thing that you touched on that I find really resonant is the fact that running as socialists, we get this relief of knowing that the work in front of us, though it is enormous, just thinking about a Green New Deal, we know and we can say loud and clear that you and I are not going to, and AOC and Bernie, we are not going to achieve a Green New Deal just us. Like, that was never the task.
Right.
The task was to step up and be coalition builders, to bring others to the table with us who both have the values and the perspectives and the experience to achieve that, and the leverage to make it politically viable. And that takes all of us. But I think that when we talk about democracy, it really is interesting to ask people for so much more than that one vote to get us into office. It is asking them to join us in our work in office. Yes. And it's so much more aspirational than what I hear on the trail all the time. In Texas, we get a lot of blue wave rhetoric, and I'm here for it. I have seen what the right-wing regime has done to my neighbors, and we have to stop it. But more than a blue wave, I am so interested in the people taking back the strongholds of power and demanding what they want. And to your point about democracy in that basic form, in that form of the ability to vote, the ability to go out into your community, feel safe, feel heard, know that is viable representation. Here, what I see is that more than half of the people in this district have not felt not just that they couldn't vote or that they were afraid to vote, but that they didn't have a reason to for an awfully long time. And I think that ideological disenfranchisement is a real threat. To think that our democracy only happens once every year or 2 years or 4 years, depending on what your what your frame of reference looks like, we're here to change that, right? We are here to bring democracy back to the everyday, to build that ideological interest, because politics, as Senator Turner said when she was here, politics follows us everywhere. It's in our homes, it's in our cars, it's in our streets, it's in our churches, in our schools, it's in our air and in our water.
Right.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the fact that we can come at this and sort of synergize what tends to be a really divisive and sometimes exclusive conversation about voting processes, and say, actually, we want that, and we want to explode the concept of democracy being an excellent and integral institution, and we want to solve for democracy on every level we can identify, because we believe in the leadership of the people.
Absolutely. I mean, I think of it as a democratization struggle at the same time that these are electoral struggles. You described it at one point as an ideological commitment, but I almost feel like it's meta-ideological in the sense that it transcends ideology, but it's this idea of almost like civic participation and its outer contours, right? And to some extent, I would even describe the vision that you're laying out as one I share as inflected with a degree of like a voluntaristic recognition of the opportunities in like an anarchy praxis to build a socialist praxis. People often think about those as lying in tension, and I think of that tension as more, frankly, theoretical than embedded in reality. And it is through, I have been part of any number of affinity groups over the years, as well as formalized nonprofits that are maybe less nimble but maybe have more reach. And this idea of being connected at your neighborhood level, being connected according to, there's a group of poets that I do actions with, having communities that we're each connected to. And here's the point I'm trying to get at is to connect to other people and inform each other, inspire each other, to frankly counsel each other, and guide each other through the complex world that I think we're all living in and increasingly often confused by, just because there are so many things, I think, coming at all of us. And when you talk about politics as being something that doesn't resonate for so many people, I think that in itself is such a poignant reflection of what I would describe as the failure of corporate Democrats to meet the needs of the moment, right? I mean, one of the things that we need to grip here is that we live in a country that doesn't practice compulsory voting, and we know that vast numbers of our neighbors don't participate in elections. So what that suggests to me is not that we have to hew to this contrived ephemeral version of a center, which is the entire approach of our corporate siblings, but rather to inform and inspire and mobilize the bases of Americans that in the voices that preceded us could not find anything to inspire them. And it's no surprise, frankly, that the corporatists have failed to inspire people. If I look, for instance, at the incumbent I'm challenging, and maybe it's an opportunity for you, we could each critique our respective, the people we're challenging. But as I look at Speaker Pelosi, I see time and time again her willingness to place corporate profits before people, before communities. And that's true. Healthcare is maybe one of the most vivid contexts. And when you talk about taking the battle for and the debate for public housing into rural communities in Texas, it reminds me of, I think, the way that Medicare for all is favored by bipartisan majorities across the United States. And there's a simple reason for that. And that is people get sick. Inevitably, people's parents, everybody has parents who get sick, and our parents getting sick or ourselves getting sick or our kids getting sick can either be opportunities for our collective resources to be put to use to ensure the best health outcomes that we can establish and achieve, or they can be opportunities for corporate predation to extract as much wealth out of anybody who's sick and their family and kick them all out into the street. And that's what we call a healthcare policy at the moment. And I think it's no surprise to me that so many of our neighbors choose not to participate when they see our elected representatives, the Democrats, saying, no, your tax dollars need to be spent on missiles, not on insulin. And I just think that's frankly insane. And how corporate Democrats have gotten away for so long with this elaborate ruse, I think that they have convinced the country to defer to corporate Democrats as the gateway to this conservatism that I think, as you pointed out, is growing increasingly virulent and dangerous. I mean, that in itself, I think, is one of the questions at the moment: is can we displace that with the humanistic vision of a brighter tomorrow that includes a federal jobs guarantee, that includes the Green New Deal, that includes, closing our prisons and implementing restorative justice alternatives to punitive carceral so-called justice, by ending the wars and redeploying our service members in climate resiliency projects instead of destructive ones. I think these are the kinds of opportunities before us. There are these such intense crises that we're confronting across all of our different communities, and I think we have equally exciting opportunities if we're able to meet the needs of the moment.
Yeah. So I love how you have a way of always framing the negative, the problem, and meeting it with an empowerment of a positive and more collective vision for the future. I think that is what we need. It's not just an it's a movement, right? It's actually shifting power. And I just, when we talk about identity and community and relationship building, when we talk about coalition, when we talk about the ways that the Democratic Party, or in my case, the Republican Party, self-identify, it's pretty interesting, and the ways that engages in my community and doesn't engage in my community. And I think what we both have come into is a work that recognizes our class consciousness. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more, because I love, again, just the re-empowerment aspect. It's not just working against it, it's working towards something. Could you talk a little bit about how your vision in your district, especially juxtaposed again with Pelosi's vision, is class struggle, is cultivating an identity in your community for folks who need a positive vision, something to strive towards and to reimagine with?
Yeah, nice. So for me, class struggle is really rooted in this, my own experience. I grew up in rural Missouri and then suburban St. Louis before the south side of Chicago. And then I came to the Bay Area in 2000 to study law. And in the faith congregation that I grew up in, it was very diverse, and there was a community of relatively wealthy immigrants, mostly physicians and their families. And there were substantial portions of the community that were African-American from North St. Louis, a part of the community that's not seen nearly as many opportunities as other parts of the area have in the last several decades. You could think of North St. Louis as one of the communities that really got the capital sucked out of it during the era of white flight. And it only more recently as it started to recover. But so when I was growing up, to see this just dramatic distinction in homes, particularly of people who literally would stand shoulder to shoulder with each other when we would pray, was a very eye-opening sort of revelation that we, despite rhetoric about being equal, certainly do not socially treat each other with anything resembling even a modicum of equality. And when I went to college in Chicago, I graduated high school early and ended up finishing college quite late, because it took me 10 years to finish college, as my family lost their house to foreclosure. And I had an experience of being unhoused, though I had friends who sort of protected me from the worst of that experience. And that also, for me, experientially seared in a perspective of the empire from beneath the boot. And I think about your Cornell West's invitation to consider justice in public as a reflection of the love that we share for each other. And it makes me think of the way you were describing the neighborliness that you encounter among the people that you're talking to in Texas. I see it here too, certainly in San Francisco. And I think that also feeds into class struggle. The irony here is that I think class struggle is also, this is what I was talking about with the sometimes very unified interests of wealthy people. I mean, I could rattle off for an hour or more wealthy people who have stood with us in the Occupy movement, who stood with us in the movement for Medicare for All, who stood with us in the movement to stop the war in Iraq. People with resources whose individual resources pale relative to the institutional weight we all confront, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the banking industrial complex. These complexes, even wealthy people are powerless in the face of these institutions. And I'm not saying for a détente against the wealthy. I'm saying that they can be allies too, especially in the service of claiming more resources for we, the public. Many of those folks, certainly here in San Francisco, I would describe effectively as class traders. People who recognize that our shared resources need to be more widely dispersed and less hoarded. I see this in a lot of different ways. You can see this particularly in the concentration of wealth and income that's emerged here in the Bay Area, for instance, as tech has become increasingly widely established. I think Austin maybe is encountering something similar. I see it also in the real estate and housing market here. California has something that approximates as much as anything else I can think of in the United States, an aristocracy, where people who own real estate, particularly in the cities, are effectively in a different class. They are effectively, they I guess we call them landlords for a reason, but it is to some extent a replication of a feudal dynamic where you have lords and the rest of us renters are, often in positions of housing insecurity, which I don't want to say it's serfdom necessarily, but there is an opportunity, certainly as it relates to uniting property renters. And here in San Francisco, because the rents are so high, many of the property renters are well off. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to unite around class interests, a economically diverse set of voices who share an interest in putting human rights and climate justice before at least corporate profits. And I think when it gets down to the opportunities to challenge interclass and intra-class tension, for me, where the big opportunity there is intergenerational wealth transmission. So my first law review article 20 years ago was about wealth and trust estates reform. And I think the fact that we allow generational trusts to pass on fortunes tax-free is insane. And it's just a function of the legal regime. And we could pass policy to ensure that these dynastic fortunes that at the moment continue to accrete and grow over time, as Thomas Piketty empirically established in his book Capital, we can shake those fortunes loose into circulation. I think it is actually possible to lift all the boats, and it's particularly by making sure that the Waltons and the Rockefellers and the next generations of Gates and Zuckerbergs aren't able to lord the fortunes of their forebears over the rest of us. Donald Trump is a perfect example of what happens when you allow resources to be accorded to family. You end up with oafs with massive fortunes. And it certainly doesn't fit the rationale of the market. No private market theorist would defend that resource allocation, at least not one in their right mind. And I think these are the failures of the market. It's the failures of a consensus that has proven its inability to allocate resources in ways that respect human rights and human needs. And I think that creates an enormous opening for us in this political moment as democratic socialists to propose alternatives that put human needs first, that pool our resources to, for instance, drive down the costs of shared goods, that expand public goods, that protect the future. It's exactly the sort of vision I'm looking forward to legislating with you when we get to Washington together.
And I think that is so fascinating. I spend so much of my life thinking through generational poverty and generational trauma, and to see those side by side is just like this. It's a more complete picture. That wealth that is multi-generational, that moves people to privilege in ways that are seemingly unquestionable, that poverty does the same, and that both of these are not just in terms of what is in our bank account, they are in terms of our development, they are in terms of our longevity, how long we will actually be on this planet, how our lungs will function, how our brains will function, how our relationships will withstand, how our houses will look, how our education will be. Like, every single aspect of our lives are so much permeated by the way we are positioned in terms of material access when we are born. I think about Roger Williams, the incumbent in this district, who is just like, I mean, he's a perfect bad guy. He doesn't just vote with Trump 97% of the time. He is the son of a used car salesman who passed his dealerships on to Roger, and Roger Williams likes to go on these long rants about how capitalists want good things and socialists want free things. So I'm really excited to be in that space with him soon. But it's fascinating to say that socialists want free things when you are a person whose money has always done the work for you. You know, who not only has that generational privilege and access, and who was set up for a different kind of life than I was set up for and you were set up for, but also like not just at the beginning of his life, not just it's not just that he was born into a nice house, it's that his house and his business have continued to grow his privilege and his power, and he's in the position that he is in now because capital works for the few, and he's one of them. And I think that class struggle politics is a way of remembering that these burdens and these opportunities are cumulative, and that rich folks, capitalists, can't just walk away from what they have. They have to help us dismantle the system that continues to propel and propagate and grow, and to take that and to share that more equally amongst us, to give more people access to more equitable opportunities. This is class struggle at its core. It is literally comparing what is possible in one of our lives, or one of the lives of the people that I work with, or one of the lives of a renter in your district, with what is possible in the life of someone who was just born in a better circumstance and has chosen to continue to let capital work for them.
When you're talking about this aspiration for the brighter day, right, and this idea that we can come together in the service of defending each other from the predatory forces that are marginalizing all of our different communities, I think there's a principle there around the solidarity between classes and taking advantage of moments in real space to connect. I mean, maybe this might be a difference, I would imagine, within different parts of your district and maybe between our districts. Here in San Francisco, as a relatively urban area, we see each other across vast differences in socioeconomic outcomes. We have tens of thousands of homeless folks literally sleeping in our streets. We also have the nation's highest concentration of millionaires and billionaires. And that confluence creates some, in some respects, really disturbing tensions. I've seen neighbors, wealthy neighbors, go to bat trying to stop services for homeless folks from being brought into their neighborhoods. And, and I've thankfully seen other neighbors, some of them also well-resourced, going to bat against their other neighbors to say, no, we want a diverse community here. We want services for folks who maybe are in the street because they got sick. And, people forget that the leading cause of homelessness is medical bankruptcy. When you see folks in the street, I think a lot of neoliberals and capitalists are inclined to think about unhoused folks as people who are somehow agents of their own misfortune, forgetting that for the plurality of people who are in the street sleeping without shelter are there because they fell ill. And because our predatory healthcare system extracts wealth from people until they don't have any more, and then we kick people into the street. I mean, it is frankly, I would say it is barbaric, but I think that that's doing a disservice to barbarians who frankly were more civilized than the practice that we have with respect to how we allocate healthcare according to profit. I think there's another piece here with respect to, as we consider the way that we relate as candidates and as voices in a movement that is growing ascendant in this crisis of contemporary corporate capitalism, to be bold. I mean, this is a principle that, another thing that I see Bernie and the squad in Congress, Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez, they're doing adeptly is striking deeply. They're swinging for the fence. They're not falling into this trap of moderating their ideas according to what the consensus might bear. And I think this idea of boldly articulating visionary alternatives that say, to hell with the consensus in Congress, what can we rally the American people around? Medicare for all is that. The Green New Deal is that. Dismantling mass incarceration is that. Taking money out of politics is that. Making sure that people can access mind-altering substances without having to risk incarceration is that. They have all these opportunities to establish social consensuses around visionary principles. And I think the establishment is frankly doing our work for us because it's so delegitimated, I think, in the lives of so many people. And here in San Francisco, housing is maybe, again, to take us back to where we were started, I think it's the most visible demonstration of the failure of the corporate paradigm. It's just the fact that we don't have enough housing. There's not only do we not have enough housing, but we have the housing of the particularly wrong kind, which is to say luxury housing that people can't afford. And so we tailor only to one part of the marketplace. And a big part of that is policy. Federal policy, the funding for affordable housing block grants drying up, particularly during the tenure of our predecessors. It was during their tenure that the federal government abandoned spending in affordable housing. The housing crisis we're seeing around the country is not unpredictable. We are running effectively to replace architects of that failure. And I hope very much to be able to make the case with you and our colleagues around the country that that system needs to be replaced, and that we as democratic socialists are poised to meet the needs of the moment with ideas bold enough to address them.
Exactly, and I deeply appreciate your understanding of and willingness to dive into issues of homelessness. We have been fighting here in Austin a campaign to decriminalize homelessness, and we won, but it has been such a nasty campaign, and it has taken me all of my patience and all of my belief in one unified working class and the potential for us to recognize ourselves, to want to build solidarity when folks who are housed are pushing down and punching down on our unhoused neighbors. And it has taken a lot of analysis to demonstrate to my neighbors, housed and unhoused, that we are not one another's enemies, actually, that it is a system that where housing is insecure for every single one of us, that it is not a guaranteed right, even though we as humans, everyone, need it. That has been a huge work, and it has been a powerful work, and I am actually tremendously thankful that has happened at this point in time when my scope has been growing, my reach has been becoming broader in this sense of our solidarity cannot be limited. Even here, I can't just have solidarity in District 25 working class folks. Not in Texas, not even in the US when we talk about climate change, when we talk about trade, when we talk about human rights issues, that are solidarity, just as in my neighborhood, has to cross borders and differences, because it is going to take a global movement of working class people to get us out of the systems of oppressions that we find ourselves in right now. I'm really hopeful, and I'm really encouraging of the movement in the UK for labor now, that I think that the conversation being had has this humanitarian bent to it. It is demanding public goods, not for one group, not for just the people who vote with and for us, but for every single person who is there, and not just there in one place, but for a more globally just economy. And I think that we are part of that, and that is powerful and sometimes a little intimidating, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to be running in a race or building coalition with folks who didn't expect that that is what is being asked of us, and not just you and I. Once again, though, I am very grateful to be here in this conversation with you, to have people who sharpen me and who understand that our districts are not so different, that we are drawing each other's districts into this work alongside of us, but who understand that it's going to take reaching far and wide. It's going to take being conscious of and accountable to a global community for us to lead the movement that I think we're looking to lead now. And I'm thankful.
That's amazing to hear that coming from Texas. Oh my God, I'm so glad you're there. And for me as an immigrant, that's something where my socialism is very embedded in sort of the post-colonial history of the, countries around the world liberating themselves in the 60s and 70s from colonial powers that preceded them. And this is an interesting moment to reflect. The incumbent who you were describing frames socialism as people looking for things for free. It's interesting to think about socialism, particularly when we think about global solidarity. Socialism is as much about saving ourselves money on a military-industrial complex that includes the entire Department of Defense, which eats about half of the federal government's budget, and the CIA, whose budget is classified. No one even knows how much money we blow on a criminal intelligence agency that's done more to create national security threats than to contain them. Add into that all of the other enforcement agencies, like the FBIs of the world, the DHS agencies, of which there are dozens, right? Like, we waste so many resources on control and incarceration and surveillance. And if we simply, and frankly, weapons, and if we just demobilized that spending, it would be one of the greatest acts of international solidarity that we could demonstrate, particularly because the Defense Department is the globe's worst carbon polluter. It's the worst institutional source of carbon pollution on the planet. If we want to show solidarity with other countries, we can do it in a way that doesn't cost a ton of money. In fact, it's going to create huge savings that we can redeploy into socialized healthcare, that we can redeploy into public housing, that we can redeploy into breakfast and lunch programs at schools and libraries across the United States, not just for kids, but for adults too. We have these resources. We simply misspend them. And I think your focus on global solidarity for me is really inspiring as an immigrant, because I do think that the movement for socialism is one that recognizes human needs. And I say human needs as opposed to citizen needs, because human needs are something that all people have. And a recognition to our shared solidarity across borders, our interest, for instance, in a right to migrate, our interests in rights to clean air and water, our interests to rights to peace and security from each other's resource wars and oil wars and interventions, and from police agencies and intelligence agencies that deny communities their own rights. I mean, this is another rabbit I'll just chase briefly. The moment after the Second World War was really poignant historically, because it was the first time, and we've lost it since, that the international community ensured human rights for people, even vis-a-vis their respective states. And we lost that principle to the Bush and Obama administrations, who tortured people and then said it was okay after we fought a world war to establish strict liability for torture. But the point of that, all I mean to say, is this idea of getting to a socialist future where we can ensure rights for each other across our borders and ensure access to resources across our different borders. I think that's a future that I want to see. It will lessen, for instance, the pressure to migrate, because so many different problems that people confront are mediated within nation states. It will also help people better achieve self-determination at the individual and the community level, because they'll be able to choose where to live instead of having their whereabouts determined for them by virtue, for instance, of their class status, to go back to your point before. I just see so many things on the table. I'm so excited for the future. I'm really glad to be in this race at the same time as you.
Absolutely. I'm glad to know your people. I am glad to build this movement alongside of you. I look so forward to the work that we have in front of us, and I feel extremely privileged and honored today to say that on behalf of myself and my campaign and my community here, you have our full support. and our full endorsement. And we are just, we are incredibly proud, and we are grateful for your work.
Right on, right back at you, sister. Same. I'm thrilled to endorse you in your campaign, and I'm eager to see what we can each do. And I'm looking forward to, tearing it up in Congress with you and after November 2020. Keep up the great work in Texas.
Amazing. You too. Be safe there in California.
Right on. Peace, sister.